Today's making project is going to be to make a USB switch box for an MP3 player, so you could choose between two MP3 sources on two different thumb drives. For this project you'll need a metal project box, but since metal project boxes are so expensive and to make it as cheap as possible, this is an old candy tin box. So you'll need a little metal box. This is about 4 by 5 inches by about 2 inches tall. 4 different kinds of hookup wire, so you'll see why there's 4 different kinds of wire in a minute. The ability to drill holes in the sheet metal box. A 4-pole double throw switch. This will allow you to select between the two USB drives once it's hooked up. Now you'll need 2 female USB ports. You'll see that there's 4 connectors on there. That's why you need the 4-pole switch, because there's 4 wires connected to these things. And the male USB port. And a USB extension cable. This end will go into the USB drive, and when your project is completed, this will go into the project case, and then the switch will switch between these two. And you'll need a length of non-conductive plastic to put in the project case. So let's get started. You also notice a soldering iron here. You're going to have to do some soldering, so you'll need some solder. And this is rosin core solder for making the connections. So you need to be able to make solder connections for this project. I tried looking on the websites and trying to find a product off the shelf, but none exists, so I had to make my own. The non-conductive material fits in the project case like that. You want to have room in the project case, so when you're putting the USB ports, so you want to have room for the thumb drives to be in here, so we want to be able to take the cover and change the music or whatever you put on these things. Music or whatever kind of music it is. You want to be able to, in my case, I want to select between public domain, like the music you're hearing now, and regular music when I'm not making a recording. So one good idea is to get a piece of masking tape. In this case, the switch will be at one end and the cable will be at the other. One end of the box will have the USB cable coming out, and you also need a little rubber grommet big enough for the USB cable to come out of, and you want the rubber grommet to keep the USB cable from being cut on the sharp metal edge of the box. And here's the box with the holes drilled out. You'll notice that the only way to get the USB cable here is to actually have to cut this, cut the metal out so you can put the grommet in and fit the USB cable through. And here's the switch hole. You notice the switch sticks out kind of far, so to make a neater appearance, use like a wood block for the switch. So it'll be a neater appearance when you put the nut and bolt on there for the switch in place. So after you cut the hole there, you want to get the USB cable. Remember, you want the female port inside the box. And once you get the cable, we use a couple of pieces of tape to hold the pieces of sheet metal so you won't cut yourself on them when you're taking the top on and off to get to the USB drives. You want to mark mounting holes for where the sockets will go, so use like a permanent marker. And once you have all these marked holes, you'll use a little tiny, like 1/16 or what, 2mm drill bit to drill these out. You don't want to have to be doing this after you have the wires in place. So these are 4 by 1/2 inch screws, and if they're a little long, you could always use a pair of cutters to cut them down. Now we're ready to start preparing for the wiring. A USB socket has 4 connections. That's why you need 4 types of wire. There's the V bus, D negative, D positive, and the ground. That's why you need 4 types of wire to keep track. You don't want to mix the connections up. You have to keep them in the right order. So now remember, so you have V bus, D minus, D plus, and ground. Take a moment now and decide what color wire you're going to use for what. I'm going to use white wire for V bus, I'll use red for D positive, yellow wire for D negative, and good old-fashioned green wire for ground. Another helpful suggestion is to get your wiring ready before you begin. So get all your wires ready and strip them. Before you begin, make sure the wires will fit through the holes, so you want to spin the wires around so the wires will fit inside the holes. And the key to a good solder project is to make sure your soldering iron tip is clean, and put a little solder on there. These jacks have a solder in them already, so once you heat the wires, it's going to start melting the solder. So heat the wire. Now after you get all the connectors hooked up, you're ready to wire it up to the switch. And to make sure you don't lose the polarity of the switch, remember you have a 4-pole double throw switch, so this will be in the middle selection, and these will be for each of the 2 drives. When the switches move from one side to the other, it'll select one side or the other. So the female ports will get hooked up to the sides, and the male port will get hooked up in the middle. We're not going to go into the male and female gender of electronics, but more knowledgeable users will get the idea. So you want to mark your polarity. You'll notice on the color key you have white, yellow, red, and green. So do a W, Y, R, and G on the color key, so you make sure you have your polarity on your switch when you're doing the wiring. Middle terminals of the switch will be hardest to get at when you're soldering. It's best to hook up the center connector first, so let's get the center connections wired up. A good idea when you're hooking up the wires to use like a small owl or screwdriver to bend the wire in place around the terminal so it'll be easier to solder. You'll always cut off the extra when you're done. Once you got the terminals on the center connector, the terminals of the switch connected, it's a good idea to use some tape to fasten the connection so they don't get in the way of the other terminals on the switch. So take some electrical tape and wrap it around the wires to put them in kind of like making a wire harness. So now the first side is done. Now it's time to wire the other female jack to the other side of the switch for the second side. It's a good idea to use a little bit of tape around the connection so the tape will help reinforce the wires, and the wires will reinforce each other, so try to avoid any loose connections. Now, after all the wires are connected, you want to inspect all the connections to make sure there's no shorts or cross connections between the switch terminals. When you're satisfied that all the connectors are okay, take a piece of tape and wrap it all around the switch to keep the wires from moving around. Once the wires are in place, you want to keep them in place so they don't move around too much, especially once they're mounted in the box. So now you want to mount the switch in the box. The switch should come with some kind of nuts and washers to put it in place. Put it so you can switch it from right or left. So using the small screws, you mount the non-conductive terminal block to the bottom of the project case, or in this case, an old candy tin. Another good benefit of the old candy tin is that it has this elevation, so it'll allow these screws to sit flush on when you have it sitting on a table, for example. So now you want to install the sockets onto the non-conductive strip inside the project box / old candy tin. And as you can see, it's all wired up. The USB drives are in place. This one is public domain, and this one is regular music that would be pulled from YouTube because it's not public domain. So right now the machine is feeding off of, we'll say this is B and this is A. Oh, that's not public domain. Turn the video.